The mountain air was too clean. It penetrated the lungs not as air, but as cold, sharp water, washing away the city smog, lies and empty vanity, leaving behind only a palpable, almost frightening silence. The house where Dr. Pavlov lived stood at the edge of the world, in a narrow valley squeezed between the Siberian mountains. It was not just a hunting ground, but a private clinic for those who were tired of playing at wealth and success. Here, 5 hours' drive from the nearest asphalt road and 3 days' walk from the nearest cell tower, Dr. Pavlov offered his clients radical therapy. A confrontation with the pure, ruthless reality of the taiga. He called it purgatory for souls poisoned by civilization. The house was wooden, sturdy, with a wide veranda overlooking a wild, impenetrable cedar forest. Inside, there was asceticism and order, which, as it turned out, could not save its owner. Ivan Andreevich Belov, 48 years old, known in these parts as Raven, sat on a fallen cedar tree about 50 meters from the house. His gaze, heavy, calm, and incredibly attentive, like that of a bird of prey, studied not so much the scene of the accident as those who now surrounded him. He was carved from stone and weathered by the winds. He was sinewy, strong, with short, thick, gray hair. He looked older than his years, and his low, hoarse voice, which he used rarely, carried the weight of the taiga echo. Next to him, leaning against his knee, sat Shadow, a West Siberian Laika, whose nickname perfectly reflected her essence. She was silent, invisible, and constantly alert. Voron trusted her more than half of humanity. His world had long since narrowed to the boundaries of the reserve, to the laws of the forest, where everything was honest and simple. There was the hunter, and there was the prey. No room for lies or half-truths. The local police's attitude toward Voron was always the same ritual, a mixture of poorly concealed contempt and complete helplessness. They, the city folks in their clean shoes and gadgets that didn't work in the taiga, considered him a savage. But they knew that outside the road, they were amateurs, and he was the only one who could restore order to their chaos. The head of the investigation team, Major Gromov, a fat, sweaty man, kept wiping his forehead. "Ivan Andreevich, at least you tell us," Gromov croaked, as if appealing to the highest authority. "The tracks lead off the road and disappear after 100 meters. It's clearly suicide. He hanged himself. Why do we need this here in the taiga? We've already filed everything." Pavlov was found in a shed, not in the house, but in an old, rotten shed, where skis and firewood were stored. The doctor, a world-renowned psychotherapist, hanged himself with a canvas noose attached to a ceiling beam. According to the official version, he left a note, short and meaningless, which spoke of freedom from reflections. The body had already been removed, but the noose and a thin layer of tiger dust on the floor remained untouched. Voron slowly got up and adjusted the old hunting knife on his belt. He knew Pavlov. They had been acquainted since their youth when they worked together in the nature reserve, one as a biologist, the other as a doctor. Back then, Pavlov sought truth in biology, not psychology. Their friendship had long been just a memory, but that was enough for Raven to come. "Suicide," Gromov repeated, wiping away sweat. Voron walked past him without responding. His method was not to look for fingerprints, but to understand the logic, or the lack thereof. He entered the barn. The smell of damp wood, cedar resin, old leather. And another smell. Fear, but not the kind of fear that makes a person take the final step. It was the fear left behind, not by the victim but by the predator. Raven looked up at the beam where the noose hung. The knot was tied neatly and tightly. He looked down at the floor. Minimal disorder. A couple of overturned buckets, but not a single tool out of place. No struggle, no panic. The Raven walked around the spot where the body had lain, which had already been taken away. He studied the floor carefully. Anyone driven to suicide, especially in such wild conditions where every day is a struggle for survival, would have made a mistake. He would have panicked, stumbled, left a trail of chaos that always accompanies a violation of the instinct for self-preservation. But here, there was neatness. It was too perfect a death for a man who, according to the police, was deeply depressed. He knew that cold, hunger, and most importantly, the animal fear of the wild change people. They cause them to make mistakes. Pavlov, he was a strong man, Voron muttered, addressing no one in particular. Even when he withdrew into his own psychology, he didn't lose his grip. The weak don't survive in the taiga. If he had wanted to die, he would have gone into the thicket and gone to sleep. That's the most honest death here, but he chose the barn. He left the barn and walked toward the road. Gromov trailed after him, hoping for a quick conclusion. Well, Ivan Andreevich, do you confirm it? A domestic tragedy? Voron stopped. He did not answer. He carefully examined the place where the trail left the road and entered the forest. The police saw a lost trail here. Voron saw a choice. The trail was shallow, wet, left by a heavy boot, but not a tourist's. And it didn't look like the footprint of someone who was running or hiding. It was confident. Too confident for a suicide. Voron dropped to one knee and narrowed his eyes. Shadow, come here, he whispered. Laika approached silently, sniffed the footprint, and her tail twitched slightly. The trail disappeared into the moss, but it wasn't lost. It was camouflaged. A few meters of confident strides, then a sudden change in gait. Smaller, sliding steps, imitating the clumsiness of a city person who had simply lost their way. But the trail itself, its depth and direction, were telltale. It was the trail of a man who knew the taiga, but was trying to hide it. A man who was not afraid, but controlled his fear. Voron stood up. He looked at Gromov with that very bird of prey look. This is not suicide, Major, he said in a low, hoarse voice. It's an imitation. And the criminal here is no city rat. He knows what he's doing. But the taiga does not forgive mistakes, even professional ones. Voron turned and went to Pavlov's house to look for mirrors. Patients whose reality was distorted and confused. He knew the killer was among them. Voron headed for Pavlov's house. Major Gromov, breathing heavily and not hiding his irritation, hurried after him. For Gromov, accustomed to protocols and office work, such disregard for procedure was the height of amateurism. Although he did not dare to argue with a man whose reputation in the taiga was legendary. Voron was not looking for traces of the criminal in the conventional sense. He was looking for an atmosphere.
He was looking for a dissonance between what his eyes saw and what his own intuition, sharpened by years of living in the forest, felt. The door to the house was not locked, but ajar. Upon entering, Voron looked around. Inside, the same asceticism and surgical order reigned as outside. Like wooden walls, simple furniture, not a single unnecessary thing. On the table lay a neat stack of books on Eastern philosophy and, oddly enough, elementary particle physics. The absence of photographs, souvenirs, or personal trinkets made the room resemble a hotel room, even though Pavlov had lived here for at least 6 months. It was a refuge, but a homeless one. He was strange, Gromov whispered, standing in the doorway. A rich man who could have lived in the capital but chose this cold place. And here is the result of his therapy. Voron ignored the Major's attempt to reduce everything to the hackneyed formula of the madman couldn't stand the loneliness. He walked over to the only desk. On it lay a diary. Voron knew that his friend, ever since their days working together at the nature reserve, had kept notes, but never trusted digital media. The diary was old-fashioned, with a leather cover that smelled of expensive paper. Voron opened it. Inside, instead of the usual appointments and schedules, there were entries dated from the last few months, titled Mirrors. Pavlov wrote about his patients not as sick people, but as beings whose reality was fatally distorted. Each name, behind which stood millions and power, was described through the prism of their main delusion. Here was the seeker of silence, the master of reflections, and the destroyer of time. These were not medical diagnoses, but philosophical labels. Voron, without reading in detail, only skimmed through the fragments. His lies have become more real than the truth. He seeks confirmation of his illusion in nature, but nature does not lie. Nature is an honest judge. Or she sees a projection of her fear in every person. I am trying to give her back her own face, but it is more convenient for her to be a mask. Voron put down his notebook. These notes did not provide an answer, but they confirmed his feeling. The killer was one of those whose life was built on distortion. But he was not catching their lies about their motives, but their lies about their behavior in the Taiga. He had everything except the truth, Major, Voron finally said. And he was looking for it here. But someone hid that truth forever. Gromov finally entered and began to pace nervously, looking around the room. Ivan Andreevich, you're turning everything into mysticism. Suicide pretending to be murder? Nonsense. And if it was murder, where are the traces? A struggle? Blood? You saw it yourself. He was hanging in the barn. He brought a rope, found a beam, and killed himself. Fatigue, depression, stress from the wild nature. Voron turned to him. His gaze was cold and heavy. You're talking about urban death, Major. In the city, suicide is a cry, an impulse, a last desperate attempt to prove something to the world that has rejected you. It's chaos, broken glasses, crumpled letters. But here is the Taiga, continued Voron, slowly and deliberately, as if giving a lecture on survival. The laws are different here. A person who decides to go into the Taiga does so quietly. He does not look for a shed that could suddenly collapse. He goes far away from civilization, so as not to disturb anyone, so that his death is as pure as nature. He lies down on the snow or freezes in a cedar forest,
accepting the end as submission to the natural course of things. It is an honest death. What we saw in the shed was a showy death. The Raven returned to his analysis of the barn. He asked the police officer to bring him a precise drawing of the room and photographs of the body that had been removed. He did not look at the face or the pose. He looked at the points of contact. How was it tied? How did the knot hold? The knot on the canvas noose he saw was not a suicide knot, hastily tied with trembling hands, but a sailor's knot. Tight, even, designed for enormous load and reliability. No one preparing for their own death would care about such perfection. They would think about the end, not the technology of its execution. Too neat, Major, whispered Voron. To reach the beam, he had to stand on something. There were buckets in the shed, but they were standing still. There was a bench, but it was moved 1/2 meter away from the center. The bench he would have used to climb up must have been kicked away violently. There should be skid marks on the floor, displaced buckets, traces of a struggle with the ground that didn't want to let him go. And what do we have? Minimal disorder. The fall was perfect. That means he either didn't struggle at all, or he was already being held. Gromov frowned, doubt flashing in his eyes for the first time. But the note, Ivan Andreevich, the note about freedom from reflections. The note is part of the performance. Voron cut him off. Pavlov had been writing about mirrors and reflections for the last few months. The killer simply used his language. He spoke with his voice to hide his own. The man who killed Pavlov wanted us to think that his death was caused by his work, his philosophy, his depression. It's a psychological trick designed for a city investigator. But I'm not an investigator, Major. I'm a hunter. And I can see that Pavlov wasn't the hunter here. Voron went back to the window and looked at the same patch of damp soil where he had found the camouflaged footprint. The footprint led into the forest. It was ambiguous. At first, it was the confident stride of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. And then there was a sharp, deliberate change in gait. An imitation of clumsiness. This was the killer's first and most important lie. A lie dictated not by fear of punishment, but by fear of unfamiliar surroundings. The killer is not just a patient. He is a man who knows how to control himself, but his control breaks down under the laws of the Taiga. We need to find these mirrors, said Voron. He took Pavlov's diary from the table. They lie. Everyone lies. But in the city, they lie with words and money. Here, in the Taiga, they lie with their behavior. They lie about how they heat the stove, how they walk, how they sit. And it is on this lie that we will catch him. Voron turned to the last page of the diary. There, in Pavlov's neat handwriting, was a list of 3 names and brief notes, as well as the locations where they currently lived, renting hunting lodges not far from the clinic. First was Kirill Svetlov, a financier, the seeker of silence. Pavlov's note read, Svetlov sees money not as a goal, but as a shield from the truth. In the Taiga, he seeks not silence, but confirmation of his power over chaos. He is dangerous when his shield cracks. Second was Margarita Zvereva, a former theater actress, the master of reflections. She lives in a constant mask, and reality for her is just a stage. She doesn't know who she is without applause. Her lies are her way of surviving. The third, most mysterious, was Alexander Nechayev,
a physicist, the destroyer of time. He seeks to destroy all conventions, including time and morality. Cold as ice, perhaps the purest, and therefore the most dangerous mirror. Voron closed the diary, his gaze softening for a moment, reflecting on the memory of a friend who tried to save hopeless souls.
He healed them, Voron said quietly, addressing the shadow who was already standing at the ready. And some of them thought the medicine was poison. He turned to Gromov, who was holding a stack of reports in his hands. Let's go, Major. We'll start with Svetlov. He's the most urban. That means his mistakes in the Taiga will be the most obvious. Raven left the house, leaving behind the smell of expensive paper and perfect order, which was the worst evidence of the crime. He knew he was following the trail of liars, but he would catch them, not by their words, but by their fear of the cold, merciless forest. Voron stepped away from Pavlov's desk, leaving the Zerkalo daily newspaper open. The atmosphere in the house did not just scream alienation. It whispered emptiness. A renowned psychotherapist, whose work consisted of searching for meaning and restoring personality, lived in a space where personality was absent. There was no history here, no traces of long-term habitation, only books, clean dishes, and perfect, sterile order. It was not a home for living, but a laboratory for experimenting on alien, distorted souls. And this laboratory, cleanliness itself, in Voron's opinion, was as fake as suicide in a barn. Pavlov sought the truth far from the city, but brought with him its most terrible virus, alienation. On the sofa lay a thin woolen blanket, perfectly folded. On the table was an empty cup, washed and placed on a saucer. Voron went to the kitchen. The electric kettle, brought from the capital, stood switched off. There were no leftovers, not a single dirty knife. A person who had just committed suicide would have left behind traces of carelessness, impulsive gestures, even in small things. He would not have bothered to wash the dishes or fold the blanket neatly. This was a ritual performed by someone else, or worse, a ritual interrupted suddenly, but then completed by the killer. Shutterstock Gromov, meanwhile, found a stack of financial documents in a desk drawer. Rental bills for 3 remote cabins within a 5-kilometer radius. Here, Ivan Andreevich, our logic, the patients. Svetlov, Zvereva, Nechayev, they're all here, in isolation. They're witnesses, and maybe debtors. The crisis, money. The Major was talking about the usual urban motives, greed, envy, passion. Voron listened to him as if it were the sound of the wind. He understood. These people had come here not for money, but for the reality they had lost, drowning in luxury and lies. And Pavlov, judging by his notes, was on the verge of showing them their true, ugly face. Voron returned to his diary. List of mirrors. He reread the short, scathing descriptions. Kirill Svetlov, financier. He sees himself as an architect of chaos, but his life is pure, boring mathematics. He seeks confirmation of his power over nature. Margarita Zvereva, actress. She does not distinguish herself from her roles. For her, the world is a stage, and when the stage cracks, she looks for a new scene, even if it is a forest. Her lies are her only capital. Alexander Nechayev, physicist. He believes that the laws of the universe, including morality, can be rewritten. A cold idealist, He doesn't lie. He creates a different truth, the most dangerous, because he believes he is right. All three are rich, influential people whose lives in the city were filled with lies. In the Taiga, they tried to escape from it, but finding themselves in harsh, honest conditions, they began to lie to nature itself, trying to hide their unpreparedness, their fear, their true motives. Voron knew that their city lies were subtle and elusive, but their Taiga lies had to leave a rough, physical trace. He looked again at the map, on which Pavlov had circled the locations of the 3 rented cabins. All of them were off the main forest road leading to Pavlov's house, but were connected by barely noticeable old hunting trails known only to locals. Any of the 3 could have come to Pavlov unnoticed. The question was how they behaved after learning of the psychotherapist's death. "Major," said Voron, his voice low and commanding. "Leave your men here. I need complete silence. We're going to Svetlov, but we're not taking the road." He nodded toward the edge of the cedar forest. Gromov choked. "But, Ivan Andreevich, why? The road is cleaner, faster. The road is for those who want to be seen." Voron cut him off. "And the killer doesn't want that. But most importantly, I need to look at the trail of lies. It's here, nearby." Voron went outside, Shadow walking beside him as always.
He approached the spot where the trail left the country road and disappeared into the damp moss and pine needles. He crouched down, his hand almost touching the ground.
It was a moment of complete concentration. When Raven ceased to be human and became the eye of the Taiga. His face, carved with wrinkles, resembled an old embossed map. He saw how the melted snow and recent rain had slightly smudged the print, but not destroyed it. But first, for the first few meters, the trail was shallow, but confident. The man walked with a full stride, without hesitation, without haste, with perfect balance of his center of gravity. It was not the trail of a tourist out for a walk, nor the trail of a bandit fleeing from pursuit. It was the trail of purposeful movement, almost a march. He wasn't afraid of the road, whispered Voron. He was sure no one would see him. It was the footprint of a man who knew what awaited him and was ready. It was the footprint of a predator. But then, after about 3 or 4 steps, everything changed. The depth of the footprint became uneven. The gait became slippery, as if the man had suddenly changed from professional shoes to soft, uncomfortable boots. He began to put his foot down, not on the whole sole, but on the heel, deliberately breaking his natural springy gait. It was a disguise. Someone was trying to make themselves look like a city slicker who could barely stand on their feet. There it is, the first mistake, whispered Raven. A person who had really lost their balance or panicked would have taken short, jerky steps, stepping on branches in an attempt to find support. Their physique would have changed under the influence of adrenaline. But this trace showed controlled chaos. The person consciously imitated clumsiness. Raven raised his head. He could sense how far this lie stretched. It began with the perfectly tied sailor's knot in the shed and ended here, at the edge of the forest, where the killer was trying to convince the Taiga that he was just a victim. He tried to convince us, Major, that his fear was the fear of an unprepared man, explained Voron, without looking at Gromov. But fear, when it is real, changes a person's weight, their balance. This same man was in perfect balance, even when he pretended to fall.
The killer seemed to have deliberately created an urban reflection of his footprint to divert suspicion from his real skills.
Voron moved along the disguised trail, which soon disappeared, dissolving into the grass. But Voron already knew the rhythm of this step, its length. He knew that this man did not go straight to his hut, but made a detour to confuse the trail. But this detour was dictated not by fear, but by calculation.
"Let's go, Shadow," said Raven. "We're going to Svetlov. Let's see how his architecture of chaos fits in with the architecture of the cedar forest.
Let's look at his broken trail." He turned toward the thicket, his figure, inseparable from the dog and the forest, quickly dissolving among the fir trees, leaving Major Gromov alone with his incomprehension and protocols. Raven knew that Svetlov would lie, but he wasn't interested in what exactly he would say. He was interested in what his tracks would say about him. The shadow walked ahead, an almost invisible wave, breaking dry branches only where it was unavoidable, as if nature itself had given its permission for this rustling. Voron moved behind it, not looking at his feet. He had already read that disguised trail and knew the rhythm of that step. So now he focused on the background, how the forest had accepted or rejected the trail that had led him to Svetlov's hut. Along the way, he did not encounter a single foreign trace, except for those left by wild animals. This meant that Kirill Svetlov, financier and seeker of silence, was isolated, left to his own devices and his expensive but completely useless equipment. The very thought that such a man, accustomed to managing billions from an air-conditioned office, was left alone with the cold and eternity of the taiga, evoked something like contemptuous understanding in Voron. Svetlov's hut was located on a tiny clearing at the foot of a rocky slope, just 4 kilometers from Pavlov's clinic. It looked new, too neat, with a shiny lock and freshly cut wood. Svetlov met them at the door, dressed in an incredibly expensive khaki hiking jacket that, judging by its appearance, had never seen real dirt or rain. He was tall and haughty, and his attempt to appear calm was as awkward as a bear trying to dance the waltz. "Are you with the police?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. His voice was measured, with a barely perceptible metropolitan accent that sounded like a mockery here among the cedars. Svetlov immediately began speaking without waiting for questions, acting out his version of an identity crisis. He talked about how Pavlov tried to help him overcome his alienation from urban lies, about the search for authenticity and genuine experience. He described their last meeting at length, during which, according to him, they discussed free will and the burden of choice. His entire speech was peppered with quotes from popular psychological works, which he had obviously read solely to maintain his image. He lied with words, trying to create an intellectual alibi. Voron stood listening to him slowly and heavily, and there was neither condemnation nor belief in his gaze. He was not looking at Svetlov, but through him, at his life. The raven's eyes fixed on the stove. Svetlov heated it with wood that looked as if it had been cut with an automatic machine, all of the same length and thickness. They were stacked in a perfect pyramid, not as a survival supply, but as an exhibit. The stove was red hot, and the temperature in the hut was too high. This was a clear mistake, made by someone who feared the cold more than common sense. A true taiga dweller stokes the stove moderately, saving wood and maintaining a stable heat, avoiding overheating. Svetlov, however, panicked about the night frosts and overdid it, and now the room was stuffy. He tried to buy warmth, as he had bought everything else in his life, not understanding that in the taiga, efficiency is valued above luxury. When was the last time you saw Dr.
Pavlov? Voron asked, ignoring the financier's long monologue on metaphysics. Last night, Svetlov replied quickly. I stopped by to see him and gave him the keys to the all-terrain vehicle he asked to look at. We talked about his health. He seemed depressed, but nothing more. And here Voron found the first crack in his behavior.
Svetlov spoke about his friend's depression with an almost indifferent tone. But his hands that, in theory, should have been busy gesturing or at least holding a cup of tea, were hidden behind his back. It was an instinctive gesture of concealment. But what was he hiding? Voron took a step forward, forcing Svetlov to retreat. Now he could see what interested him more than words. Shoes. The financier was wearing tall, incredibly expensive hunting boots with reinforced soles. They were almost clean, but Voron noticed an unusual mark on them. The soles, designed for sure footing on the ground, were worn down at the edges, and the laces were tied not for hiking, but too tightly, almost to the point of pain. This indicated that Svetlov, trying to walk on rough terrain, constantly strained the arch of his foot and shifted his weight to the outside to avoid slipping and falling. This is a sign of panic fear, of uneven surfaces. Your all-terrain vehicle, was it parked by the doctor's house? Voron continued to ask abstract questions, focusing only on Svetlov's reaction. Yes, of course. I picked it up yesterday. I fixed a minor breakdown. I told the police. They know. Svetlov spoke again about his crisis, about how the Taiga finally showed him its true face. And here, while the financier was busy with his psychological performance, Voron noticed one detail on his immaculate jacket. On the right sleeve, just above the elbow, there was a barely noticeable scuff, as if the fabric had been pressed against something rough with force. Were you scared? Voron asked suddenly. The question was asked in a low, hoarse voice that sounded like a reproach. Svetlov flinched. His arrogant mask cracked. Of course I'm scared, Pavlov. It's a shock. And this damn Taiga. I saw bear tracks half an hour ago when I was chopping wood. This isn't a city, Ivan Andreevich. There are no rules here. No control. There were real notes of horror in his voice. It wasn't fear of the police or the investigation. It was an animalistic, instinctive fear of wild nature, which doesn't obey financial laws and knows no compromise. Voron understood. Svetlov was lying, trying to hide his lack of courage. He had come here seeking power over chaos, but found only his own inner chaos, projected by the Taiga. He really had been at Pavlov's. He may even have quarreled with him. But his main fear was not murder, but revealing his weakness in front of the forest. He tried to look confident, but his worn-out boots, overheated stove, and hidden hands spoke of the constant, exhausting stress of survival, which was far stronger for him than Pavlov's death. Voron turned and looked at Gromov, who, as always, was only writing down words. He's not our man, Major, Voron said. His lies are too primitive. He's not hiding the traces of a criminal. He's hiding the traces of his fear of the Taiga. The man who committed this murder is not afraid of cedar trees or bears. He is afraid of the truth. Svetlov, on the other hand, is afraid of everything he can't buy. Voron pointed to a scuff on the sleeve. This mark is from rough bark. When he was chopping wood, he did it clumsily, pressing himself against the trunk so he wouldn't fall, so he could feel support. His panic is real, but it's not about Pavlov's death. The conclusion was simple. Kirill Svetlov was a victim of himself, a broken businessman whose life had already been destroyed by isolation. He was not a murderer, but material for murder. Voron put the hut under police surveillance, not because Svetlov was a suspect, but because he could be a witness, whose memory had been distorted by pure horror. "Now to the actress," said Voron, looking in the direction where, according to the map, Margarita Zvereva's hut was located. "Let's see how the actress plays the role of a survivor in a setting that cannot be changed." He had to change his method, from reading the traces of fear to reading the traces of the performance. Voron and Shadow walked along an old, barely visible path, which, according to his calculations, should have been the shortest route from Svetlov's hut to Margarita Zvereva's temporary shelter. The path was difficult. Steep climbs, slippery roots, fallen trunks. If Svetlov, this broken businessman, made a mistake because he feared the Taiga, then Zvereva, the master of reflections, must have made a mistake because she did not respect it. For an actress accustomed to the world changing at the whim of the director and set designer, the harsh immobility of the Siberian forest was her most formidable enemy. She tried to create her own performance here, but nature did not obey her. Unlike Svetlov's new and neat cottage, Margarita's hut was an old, crooked winter shelter, which she had apparently rented for a fabulous sum of money to emphasize her closeness to the people or depth of suffering. On the approach path, which was more of a direction than a road, Voron stopped. Here, on the dark, damp ground covered with last year's leaves, he found what he was looking for. Not the tracks of a predator, but the tracks of something out of place. The prints of her shoes were shallow but clear. She was not wearing hiking boots, but judging by the shape of the heel and sole, some very expensive city shoes, insulated with fur but completely unsuitable for walking on slippery roots and stones. These were shoes for show, not for action. She had brought her city mask here but forgotten the laws of physics. The raven noticed that the footprints were uneven. She wasn't walking, she was sliding, clinging, often putting her foot sideways. In some places, the footprints were too close together, indicating tense, uneven movement, caused not by running, but by fear of falling, and an unfamiliar silence that was worse than screaming for an actress. She tried to look indifferent, but her body, her gait, her footprints betrayed constant, exhausting stress. She was walking towards Pavlov, Voron said quietly, and Shadow, understanding her master's tone, crouched down. But she was walking, not as a witness, but as a spectator who had been forcibly dragged from the audience onto the stage. Svetlov's lie was the lie of a weak man who feared the Taiga. Zvereva's lie was the lie of a strong woman who feared losing control of her image. They approached the winter hut. Margarita Zvereva came out to meet them. She was about 40 years old, but she looked 20, thanks to plastic surgery and the makeup she had applied that morning, which, however, was useless against the redness caused by the wind and coal. She was dressed in elegant but completely impractical clothes, a thin sweater with a high collar and a knitted hat that could be seen in the pages of glossy magazines. Here, in the Taiga, she looked like a foreign body. She began to speak immediately, her voice pitched for the big stage, velvety, deep, with perfect pauses calculated for effect. "You must be from the police. I'm very sorry. Dr. Pavlov was a genius." She pronounced the word genius with such dramatic intonation
as if she herself were his muse. He tried to restore my true essence, to remove the masks I had worn all my life. Voron did not interrupt her. He let her play. She spoke of Pavlov as an evil puppeteer who forced her to confront her shadow. She claimed she had an alibi. She had spent the entire evening in the hut trying to absorb the silence and understand her new role. Her entire speech was a series of clichés, as if she were reading lines from a second-rate play. While she was talking, Voron examined her hut. It wasn't just messy. It was decoratively chaotic. Pillows scattered on the floor, a half-empty bottle of expensive wine, crumpled napkins. But at the same time, carefully placed candles and incense sticks created a theatrical, bohemian coziness. A person under stress or depression would either drown in real dirty chaos or, like Pavlov, find salvation in sterile order. Zvariva chose the middle path, chaos that can be controlled and looks good on stage. His attention was drawn to the hearth. She tried to stoke it, but her attempts were as clumsy as her gait. The wood lay carelessly in the fireplace. The fire was weak, and thin grey smoke came out of the chimney. She did not understand the laws of fire, the main law of survival in the Taiga. Her lie was not in her words, but in her disregard for vital processes. She was too busy with her role to care about warmth. "When was the last time you saw Dr. Pavlov?" asked Voron, his voice dry and emotionless, which was worse than any scream for an actress. "The day before yesterday afternoon. He and I had a very difficult session. He said that I was the biggest mirror of lies in his life. It was hard, but I managed." She tried to put on a mask of fortitude, but her eyes betrayed her. They did not show fear of the police, but resentment that her performance was not appreciated. Voron did not press her. He knew that an actor could not be caught in a lie, but could be caught in the physiology of the role. He pointed to her shoes. "Your shoes. Did you wear them to Pavlov's house?" Margarita frowned slightly and replied, "Of course. I'm not going to walk barefoot here." "And were they comfortable to walk on roots?" Voron continued. "They are very good shoes, Ivan Andreevich. European quality." "European quality won't save you from tiger mud," Voron objected. "And your footprints on the trail show that you panicked at every slippery rock. You were constantly struggling with the ground. Your gait was nervous. You tried to appear indifferent, but your body was tense. A person who has truly found peace within himself walks here smoothly, obeying the rhythm of the forest. Your lie is the lie of a weak person who could not find a new role for himself in the Taiga, and Pavlov, apparently, wanted to show you that you are nobody without your script." At that moment, instead of anger or denial, Margarita Zvereva changed. Her face became empty. Her voice lost its velvety quality. It was not acting, but a failure of the role. She looked at Voron with horror, but not at him, but at the truth he had revealed. She ceased to be an actress and became simply a woman frightened by her own emptiness. "I hated him," she whispered. "He made me look in that mirror. He said that my true self was just a hysterical, aging woman who was afraid of loneliness." She did not confess to murder. She confessed to hatred, which was more real to her than the crime. Raven understood that her lie was a lie of resentment, a lie of a broken ego. She was capable of murder out of revenge for a shattered illusion.
but her physical weakness and lack of skill in the Taiga suggested that she could not have left the confident trail he had seen near Pavlov's cabin. Voron turned to Shadow.
She's not a predator, Shadow. She's just a bird in a golden cage, hysterically flapping against the bars. He looked at Svereva. You were at Pavlov's the day before yesterday. You had a fight. You got scared of the Taiga and came back to play out your drama here. That's the whole truth. Zvereva nodded, unable to speak, her perfect makeup beginning to crack. Raven didn't detain her. He knew she was incapable of the controlled and calculated murder that had been committed. He left the hut. Margarita Zvereva was not the killer, but only one of the props the killer used as a cover. Voron headed back to the main road to continue his illogical search. He knew that the killer had left no trace of panic, like Svetlov, or resentment, like Zvereva. He left traces characteristic of overcoming fatigue and cold, not of an attempt to escape. These were the traces of a professional who disregarded logic in order to hide his true skills. And these traces led in a completely different direction. Voron returned to Pavlov's house alone, leaving Major Gromov with his protocols and orders. He circled the clinic grounds, focusing on the perimeter where the police had not set foot. The Taiga had its own protocol of lies and truth. Svetlov's lies were lies of weakness and fear of the elements. Zvereva's lies were lies of contempt and fear of losing herself. Neither of them was capable of the cold, calculated trail that Raven found near the shed. The killer was different. The killer controlled not only his behavior, but also his condition. He did not run away in panic, did not try to hide his identity behind drama. He committed a murder that was carefully disguised as suicide, and then left with a confident but masked step. Such a trail spoke of composure, knowledge of the forest, and the ability to withstand prolonged stress. Voron ran his hand over the damp, mossy soil. He knew that a person capable of such self-control must have made a mistake in another, more physiological aspect. In the Taiga, after any action requiring great emotional and physical exertion, the hunger protocol and the fatigue protocol come into effect. The body demands compensation. A person seeks not a place to flee, but a place to recover. The typical urban criminal, after committing murder, runs to the road, to a car, to civilization. But this killer left a trail leading deep into the forest, in the opposite direction from his hut. It was illogical. Why go deeper when you can get away? The Raven activated his inner knowledge. If a skilled person decides to go deeper into the forest, he is not trying to escape. He is trying to hide. Hide not from pursuit, but from the cold and hunger, until the initial emotional shock subsides and enough time passes for the trail to be washed away by rain or covered by pine needles. The killer was looking for a delay and a hiding place. He moved in the direction indicated by the confident trail. The shadow walked ahead, his nose working like the most accurate detector. After about a mile, in a small ravine where thick cedar trees grew and the soil was dry, the shadow stopped. Raven approached. In this place, hidden from the wind and from the air, someone had built a fire. This was not the trace of a tourist's rest stop. The fire pit was small, its walls neatly lined with stones, and the ashes were almost completely covered with fresh moss and pine needles. The moisture under the moss was barely worn. It was a fire that burned for a short time,
but gave off a lot of heat. No city amateur, not even Svetlov in his expensive gear, could have camouflaged it so well, and more importantly, would not have done so.
City dwellers are not afraid of fire. They are afraid of effort. They would have left the fire on the stones and left. A professional trace, whispered Voron. The man had built a fire to recover. His goal was not to escape, but to control his physiology.
The killer was tired and cold. Cold penetrates the body instantly, especially after intense emotional stress. Fatigue and hypothermia are the enemies of control.
The killer knew this and decided to stop to burn wood and restore his fighting ability.
The raven carefully raked through the remains of the fire. Among the ashes, he found several small, thin twigs used for kindling.
It was dry dead wood, proof that the man did not waste time cutting wood and looked for flammable material. Perfect energy conservation. The killer was not just prepared, he was cautious and calculating. He knew how the Taiga worked and how it made people make mistakes. But here, at the edge of the fire pit, he found another, more important clue that exceeded his expectations. In the dry ground, untouched by the fire, he found a barely noticeable imprint. It was not a footprint, but a knee print. The person had been squatting for a long time, resting their knee on the ground. But next to the knee print was another, thinner and sharper mark, apparently left by the corner of a box or a hard object that they had been holding on their knee while warming themselves. The killer had sat here and probably waited for time to pass, for his body to return to normal, for his mind to calm down. But what was he doing with this hard object that left such a mark? Raven bent down even lower. He tried to imagine what the man had been doing in this place. He hadn't been eating. There were no traces of food. He hadn't been sleeping. The fire was too small. He had been working or thinking. And at that moment, in this complete isolation, where there were no eyes or witnesses, he must have returned to his true essence. He must have returned to that distorted reality that Pavlov wrote about. The raven rose. He knew that this fire was the killer's point of concentration, his temporary center of power. The man was not afraid here. He controlled his fear through physical effort. And then, after resting, he moved on again, and his trail must have been even more confident and secretive. Voron looked at the direction the trail led from the bonfire. It did not lead to the road, nor to the clinic, but across all obvious paths. It led in the direction of the third patient, Alexander Nechayev, a physicist, the destroyer of time. It was irrational. Why would the killer go to another patient? Unless Pavlov's murder was not the end, but only part of a larger plan. He remembered Pavlov's notes about Nechayev. He doesn't lie. He creates another truth. Cold as ice, perhaps the purest and therefore the most dangerous mirror. Nechayev claimed that he was looking for absolute silence in the Taiga in order to hear the true code of the universe, free from the noise of civilization. Voron realized that his usual logic would not work here. He had to think like a man whose reality was distorted, but whose survival skills were professional. He didn't try to escape, Voron whispered. He waited out the crisis to make sure his trail was good enough. And then he moved on. But why? There could only be one answer. The killer wasn't afraid of being found.
He was afraid of being found too soon, before he finished distorting reality.
Raven, without delving into philosophy, focused on the physics of movement. The trail from the campfire led to a small, bush-covered mountain strain. A person walking in that direction would have to either go around it or cross it.
Going around would take a long time and waste energy. Crossing would risk getting your feet wet and losing heat, which in the taiga is tantamount to a mistake. The raven moved toward the river.
The shadow followed him, its fur raised by the unusual mixture of smells, the fire, human sweat, and something metallic. On the riverbank, where the rocks were slippery and wet, he found another trace that the police would never have noticed.
It was not a footprint, but a small, flat stone that had been moved at the very edge of the water. The stone had not been moved by a foot, but by something heavy and straight. The person had crossed the river, but not by wading.
He must have used a pole or a long stick for balance, jumping from stone to stone so as not to get his shoes wet. It was an excessive effort for a simple crossing, but it showed perfect control over his condition.
The killer did not want wet feet. He did not want to waste energy fighting the cold.
The raven looked up. The river led to a narrow path that went to the foot of the mountain, where, according to the map, Nechaev's hut was located.
He knew he was on the right track. The killer, for all his sophistication, could not circumvent the survival protocol. He made a mistake, which was dictated not by fear of punishment, but by fear of cold and hunger.
And now he was moving toward his goal. But what was that goal? Feeling the cold growing, Raven realized that he was not just following a trail, but the chronology of the criminal's physical and psychological states. In this forest, where there were no judges or witnesses, the killer had been caught by his own professional habit of conserving his strength. And that habit was now leading Raven to the most dangerous mirror.
Voron moved along the riverbank, following a barely noticeable, professionally controlled trail.
The trail led him to the hut of Alexander Nechaev, a physicist who, according to Pavlov's notes, was the purest and most dangerous mirror. Svetlov and Zvereva made mistakes dictated by fear and resentment. They were city patients. But the killer, who left behind a trail with perfect camouflage and a place to regain his strength, was different. He obeyed the survival protocol, which meant that his mistakes had to be logistical, not emotional. The police, whom Voron mentally compared to flies banging against glass, sought logic in financial machinations, love triangles, or quarrels over money. Gromov was surely questioning Svetlov and Zvereva about their last conversations with Pavlov, trying to find a verbal motive. But Voron knew that a murder in the taiga, committed with such cold calculation, had nothing to do with words. It had to do with actions and the landscape. The trail Voron was following led him to a large swamp between the river and the foot of the mountain, where Nechaev's hut stood. The swamp was old, with a solid bottom, and a straight path ran through it, well known to Voron, shortening the route by at least a mile. Anyone who knew the forest would take this path. Anyone in a hurry would take this path. But the trail suddenly veered off. It turned sharply to the right, beginning a long, senseless detour around the edge of the swamp, through thick thickets of dwarf cedar and rocky scree. It was a move that defied the logic of survival, the main axiom of the taiga, which demanded economy of effort. The raven stopped. The shadow sniffed the turn, her nose expressing confusion.
"Why, Shadow?" whispered Raven.
Why would a person who professionally conserves energy, a perfectly camouflaged campfire, waste it senselessly? Circumventing the swamp along this route took an extra half hour and required overcoming difficult obstacles that could easily have been avoided. Raven put forward his hypothesis. It was not a mistake. It was a deliberate distortion of behavior.
The man was not afraid of the swamp. He was afraid of time. If the killer had committed the murder last night and spent the night recovering his strength by the fire, he needed to explain his long absence.
If he had returned to his hut by the shortest route, his body would not have accumulated enough fatigue. His physical condition would not have matched his story that he had been searching for silence all day or got lost. He was trying to kill time, Voron realized, and exhaust himself. He made this senseless move so that when they found him, his appearance, his sweat, his physical exhaustion would confirm his false reality. He wanted to look like an exhausted survivor, not a calculating killer. He tried to imitate the stress of the Taiga to justify his absence and hide the time he spent with Pavlov and the campfire. It was a sophisticated lie, calculated not for the police, but for the circumstances. The killer understood that in the isolated Taiga, where there were no cameras or witnesses, his main alibi would be his physical condition. If he looked like he had spent 2 days in the forest, fleeing from the cold and fear, who would doubt his words? Voron felt the tension mounting. He was dealing not just with a murderer, but with a man who had perfect control over his body and mind, in order to create a false image of a victim. This was Alexander Nechayev, the destroyer of time, whose reality, according to Pavlov, was cold and flawless. Voron took a detour. Each step he took was now not just a pursuit, but a test of his hypothesis. On a rocky slope, where the ascent was particularly steep, Voron noticed that the killer's footprints were even, with no signs of stumbling or panic. The man walked heavily, but rhythmically, like a machine. It was a movement of deliberate fatigue. Raven stopped, examining the thick undergrowth. He discovered another, more subtle mistake. In one place, where a branch of a dwarf cedar had been broken, the fragment was unusual. Usually, when a person accidentally breaks a branch, they do so at the point of least resistance. But this fragment was broken in the middle, with a clean, straight break characteristic of a deliberate action. The killer, walking along this nonsensical route, was marking his path. Why? To be able to return along it, or, more likely, to confirm his route, if asked about his whereabouts. He wasn't just walking. He was documenting his lie.
Voron felt a cold respect for this man's sophistication. He did not try to cover his tracks. He created them. Traces of his survival and delusion. It was a logic devoid of fear, a logic of absolute control. After half an hour of walking around the swamp, it was behind him. The trail led Raven to the foot of the mountain, where Nechayev's hut stood leaning against a rock. It was the most remote, the most isolated. Even the most passable vehicles could not reach it. Alexander Nechayev was standing near the hut. He was unlike Svetlov with his ostentatious luxury, or Zvereva with her theatricality. Nechayev was pure function. He was of average height, dressed in unremarkable but high-quality grey hiking clothes, with a face that could have belonged to a scientist, an accountant, or a philosopher, so devoid of any distinctive features was it. He looked tired. His eyes were slightly swollen, and his movements were a little slow.
which perfectly matched the legend of exhausted survival. Nechayev watched Voron and Shadow approach with a barely noticeable, almost laboratory-like interest. There was no fear, surprise, or even resentment at the intrusion in his eyes. There was only assessment, as if he were observing the reaction of a chemical element to the introduction of a catalyst. "Ivan Andreevich Belov," Nechayev said quietly, as if reading from a screen. "Dr. Pavlov spoke highly of you. He referred to you as a person who seeks truth in matter, not in consciousness. You are a Taiga detective." Voron did not answer, allowing the silence of the Taiga to speak for him. He examined Nechayev. His boots were covered with an even layer of wet mud. No rush, no inappropriate style. He looked like a man who had spent several days in the forest, completely adapting to the conditions. "I heard about Pavlov's tragedy," Nechayev continued. His voice was even, emotionless, like a journal entry. He sought freedom from reflections, and apparently found it in the most tragic form. He was an honest man, but, like all of us, broken. Voron moved closer, studying Nechayev as he would study footprints on the ground. He noticed that despite all his fatigue, Nechayev stood perfectly straight. His back was level. He did not stand in the relaxed posture of an exhausted man, but in a posture of anticipation. "The police believe it was suicide," said Voron. "What about you?" Nechayev smiled, but it was not a smile of joy, but a logical statement. "I believe that everyone gets the reflection they deserve. If Pavlov wanted the world to see his death as suicide, then the world should get that scenario." "Truth, Ivan Andreevich, is always relative. The only question is who controls the original source." Voron felt that he was on the verge of a confrontation with a true, flawless predator. Nechayev's lie was not in the details, but in his very philosophy. He did not lie about his actions. He lied about the meaning of those actions. And this lie was far more dangerous than Svetlov's fear, or Zvereva's resentment. "Have you been traveling for a long time?" asked Voron, his gaze fixed on the even layer of mud on Nechayev's boots. "A long time," Nechayev replied. "I was looking for absolute silence. I was going to the lake, but I got a little lost and had to go around the swamp. I only got back an hour ago, completely exhausted." His words perfectly confirmed his senseless movement and fatigue. "Do you know these places well?" asked Voron. Nechayev shrugged. "As well as a man seeking order in chaos can know them. I am a physicist. I look for patterns, not coincidences. And, like you, I know that nature is always honest. It does not forgive mistakes, neither in physics nor in morality." Voron did not question him further. He knew that Nechayev's words were part of his defense, his distorted reality. He was too flawless. But somewhere in this perfect control, there had to be that very mistake that a predator makes when he thinks he is stronger than nature. Voron knew that the killer was not afraid. He was too confident, and it was this confidence that would be his trap. Voron walked away from Nechayev's hut. He left Major Gromov, who had finally arrived on the scene, alone with the scientist. The police was satisfied. They had found a man whose legend of meaningless movement and exhausted survival was flawless. Nechayev spoke of absolute silence and order. His answers were logically structured and contained no emotional outbursts. Gromov was convinced that he was dealing with nothing more than a witness whose thinking was distorted by philosophy,
not crime. But Voron knew that it was Nechaev's impeccability that was the biggest lie.
He returned to the campfire in the ravine, which was the center of the protocol of hunger and fatigue.
It was here that the murderer, after committing the act of violence, allowed himself to stop and recover, preparing for the next stage of his lie, the imitation of exhaustion.
Voron crouched down again, examining the place where there was a barely noticeable knee print and a mark from a hard object. His gaze, heavy and calm, moved from the fire pit to the surrounding area. Raven had already determined that this confident trail, leading away from Pavlov's cabin, belonged to someone familiar with the taiga. He also knew that Svetlov and Zveriva were not capable of such physical and psychological training.
That left only Nechaev. Voron picked up a piece of fir branch from the ground, which had obviously been blown there by the wind. He used it to carefully rake the moss around the fire pit. He was looking for a second reflection. Physical proof that the footprint he had seen at Pavlov's house had been left by this particular person. And he found it. Under a thick layer of moss in the dry earth, Voron discovered a clear imprint of a sole. It was a footprint from Nechaev's boot, exactly the same as the one he had seen on the scientist's feet, only dirty and wet. Nechaev was too confident in his camouflage of the fire to think about covering up the footprints around it when he was kneeling. Voron pressed his finger against the print. The depth and shape of the mark were identical to the clear print he had found near Pavlov's shed. Before Pavlov began to feign clumsiness, it was irrefutable proof. Alexander Nechaev was not a witness, but a criminal who had cold-bloodedly murdered Pavlov. But why did Nechaev, a man of order and logic, make such an illogical mistake, going to Pavlov and then returning to his hut by a roundabout route? Feigning fatigue was only part of the answer. Voron raised his head. He remembered how Nechaev stood by his hut, perfectly straight despite his exhaustion. He remembered his words. Truth, Ivan Andreevich, is always relative. The only question is who controls the original source. He lied not about what he did, but about who he was, whispered Voron. Nechaev was a scientist who sought order and control. For him, Pavlov's murder was not an act of passion or revenge, as it was for Zveriva, but the removal of a variable that threatened his ideal reality. Pavlov, according to his own notes, tried to destroy all conventions, including morality. Nechaev killed to preserve his system. Voron returned to the knee print and the mark left by a hard object. If Nechaev wasn't just warming himself by the fire, but waiting, and at the same time holding a hard, angular object on his knee, what could it have been? It couldn't have been a thermos or food. The angle was too sharp. He remembered again the sailor's nut in Pavlov's shed. Perfectly tied, reliable, indicative of method. And Pavlov's note about freedom from reflections. Nechaev was a cold idealist. Voron came to the only conclusion. Nechaev not only killed Pavlov and covered his tracks, but was also preparing for the next step. The hard object that left the mark could have been a map, or more likely, a tool. "You're too sure of yourself, physicist," Voron whispered. "A killer who prepares so carefully for his legend is bound to forget the little things once his original plan is complete." "The biggest mistake a predator can make is pride,"
and confidence in his own infallibility. Voron walked from the campfire towards Nechaev's hut. Now his goal was to find that very mistake on the needle. A tiny, nervous detail that Nechaev, for all his perfect preparation, could not control. A detail that would betray his animal horror at what he had done, which he tried to hide behind the mask of a scientist. He knew that Nechaev, like all city dwellers, had underestimated the pure, ruthless reality of the taiga. The taiga does not forgive control. It demands submission. And now that Voron knew who the killer was, he could read his next lie not from the traces, but from his illogical behavior. Voron returned to Pavlov's house at dusk. Major Gromov and his men had already left the scene of the crime, satisfied with Nechaev's legend of an exhausted traveler. For them, investigators who thought in terms of logic and motive, Nechaev was too cold and too distant from emotion to be a murderer. For Raven, who was looking for a violation of the natural order, his flawlessness was the only proof of guilt. The killer was not afraid. He was too confident. Voron knew that for all his sophistication, for all his disguises and senseless detours, Nechaev had to make one last, nervous mistake. A mistake dictated not by fear of punishment, but by pure animalistic horror at overcoming an inner taboo, the killing of a human being. This horror is not visible in the traces. It cannot be read in words. It manifests itself in micro-movements, in uncontrolled gestures, when the body betrays the mind for a moment. He entered the house, which now seemed even colder and emptier. Voron stood in the middle of the room, closed his eyes, and tried to see the scene through the eyes of the murderer, Nechaev. Nechaev comes to Pavlov, commits the murder, carefully stages a suicide to hide the traces of a struggle, leaves a note written in Pavlov's language, and leaves to regain his strength by the fire and think through his alibi. Perfect. But when did it happen? The killer leaves the shed. He returns to the house to pick up something important, something he couldn't leave behind. Perhaps it was Pavlov's notes about him, or more likely the murder weapon, which could have left traces. And then, after everything is clean, when the brain says that control has been restored, the body makes an involuntary gesture. The raven approached the window, through which Nechaev had most likely surveyed the area before leaving. He carefully examined the wooden windowsill, covered with a thin layer of dust and pine needles. In the very corner, where the windowsill meets the window frame, the raven found what he was looking for. It was a tiny, barely noticeable scratch, as if made by the tip of a needle or a thin metal corner. The scratch was shallow, only about 2 millimeters deep, but it was fresh, and beneath it was visible light-colored, unweathered wood. Nearby, stuck to the edge of the frame, lay a tiny, dry fragment of a branch or pine needle. It was a needle mistake. The scratch was not made deliberately. It was left by an object that Nechaev was holding in his hand when his control faltered. The man who had just cold-bloodedly killed someone stands at the window, looking into the night, and his mind, like a string stretched to the limit, snaps for a moment. The hand holding the object trembled and scratched the wood. There it is. Your truth, physicist, whispered Voron. It was a trace of deep animalistic horror at what had been done. Not fear of being caught, but horror at the violation of his own system. The scientist,
who wanted to create a new order, was suddenly confronted with the irrationality of life and death. And his body reacted with a nervous spasm. But what kind of object left such a mark? It was angular and metallic.
Voron remembered the mark by the fire pit, the imprint of the corner of a box or a hard object that Nechayev had been holding on his knee. A physicist seeking absolute silence. What could be angular and metallic? A telephone? No, Nechayev would not have left it so carelessly. A tool? Voron returned to Pavlov's notes. Nechayev, the destroyer of time. A man who believed that the laws of the universe, including morality, can be rewritten. And then it dawned on Voron.
He remembered the sailor's knot in the shed. A perfect knot. A knot that requires not only skill, but also a tool for perfect tightening. Some kind of thin lever or needle. It was not a rope knot, but a knot tightened mechanically.
And what was the most likely angular, metal object that a person obsessed with order and mechanics would carry with them? Nechayev may have been holding a box or case with measuring instruments, or even a portable tape recorder in an angular case, on which he recorded his version of the philosophical justification for the murder. Or the recording that Pavlov made in his last moments. The scratch on the windowsill was the needle that pierced his perfect defense.
Voron knew that the killer had left the scene of the crime to wait and prepare for the next stage of his game.
Now that his alibi as a weary traveler had worked on the police, Nechayev waited. Voron went to the window and looked out into the darkness. He remembered that a sharp, cold snap was expected tomorrow, possibly even the first snow. It was the perfect condition for a final escape or a final hideout. "You didn't run, physicist," whispered the raven. "You waited. You waited until your tracks froze or were covered with snow. You waited for the perfect storm."
And it was a logistical decision that again contradicted the logic of honest survival, but perfectly matched the logic of a controlling predator.
Raven knew that Nechayev, as a man seeking isolation and absolute control, would not return to civilization until he was certain of his victory. He would seek the perfect hideout, a place that mirrored his own alienation and order. It would have to be an abandoned but secure hut that only he knew about.
And it would have to be in the opposite direction from all the obvious paths. The raven left the house, leaving behind a tiny scratch, the only honest clue.
His hunt was just beginning. The raven stood on the threshold of Pavlov's house. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind carrying the icy, prickly air from the mountains. The sky was heavy and leaden. In a few hours, it would snow. It would be the perfect storm. A natural disaster that would forever erase all traces and close the police investigation into the suicide. But for Raven, it was the perfect hunting conditions. Nechayev, the destroyer of time, was too smart to run into civilization while his boots were still covered in Taiga mud. He was too methodical to let his pursuers catch up with him. His goal was not to flee, but to wait it out. He had to hide in a place that would provide him with maximum isolation and control. The raven knew how a person whose reality was distorted behaved when faced alone with harsh, unforgiving nature. Svetlov sought power. Zvereva sought the stage. Nechayev sought order. His refuge had to be his mirror image, a place where he could wait until the snow covered his lies, and where he could only be found by a logistical error. He spread an old, worn map of the area on the table. Within a 10-kilometer radius of Nechayev's hut, there were only 3 abandoned winter huts.
One was too close to the road. The second was in a low-lying area near a stream, too damp and conspicuous. The third, marked only with a cross, was high in the mountains, on a plateau lost among the rocks and tall cedar trees. It was a dead zone, where neither hunters, poachers, nor even geologists went. "Perfect," whispered Voron. "A person seeking absolute silence would go there." The winter hut on the plateau, known as the Stone Ear, was built at the beginning of the century by gold prospectors. It was almost invisible from the ground, protected from the wind by a rock, and provided total isolation. To get there, Nechayev would have to pass through the most difficult part of the taiga, a gorge known as the Dragon's Mouth, and then climb up to the plateau. It was a difficult, exhausting route that Raven could cover in 5 or 6 hours. For Nechayev, exhausted by his senseless movement, it would take all 8. But it was this extra effort that guaranteed him absolute safety. Voron understood Nechayev's logic. The killer did not want to be found. But if he was found, he should look not like a fugitive, but like a victim of circumstances. He could sit in the Stone Ear until the snow fell. By the time the police finally reached his hut, he would already be somewhere else. And when they found him, he would look like a man who had survived the storm, whose presence in the dead zone could only be explained by his desire for solitude. But Voron wasn't going to follow the trail. He was going to catch Nechayev on his overconfidence. He knew that Nechayev had most likely taken everything he needed for a long isolation. Food, tools, the same ones that left marks on the windowsill, and possibly Pavlov's notes or the murder weapon. Most importantly, Nechayev was confident that his flawless lies and senseless movements had completely confused the investigators. Voron glanced at Shadow. Laika was calm but tense. She sensed the impending change in the weather. "Let's go, Shadow. We will not follow the path of his delusion, but the path of his pride." Voron chose an alternative, even more difficult but shorter route, through a narrow mountain range that shortened the journey by 2 hours. This route required not only endurance, but also professional climbing skills and perfect knowledge of the terrain. Nechayev, despite all his training, would not have dared to take it. It was too risky and did not fit in with his logic of control. As Voron climbed over moss and wet rocks, he thought about his plan. He wasn't going to arrest Nechayev. He was going to expose him. In the taiga, as in life, justice is not about punishment, but about restoring order. Nechayev had broken that order by killing the man who had tried to give him the truth. He had to show Nechayev that his perfect system of lies had been destroyed by one small, nervous mistake on the windowsill. He had to prove to him that control over matter did not mean control over conscience. Voron knew that this last journey would be the hardest. At altitude, the wind became piercing, carrying tiny icy grains, harbingers of snowfall. Nechayev's route was long, but logical in terms of camouflage. Voron's route was short and irrational in terms of safety, but it allowed him to arrive first. When Raven reached the ridge, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in eerie red and purple tones. Far below, in the thick, dark taiga, he saw a trail that he guessed was left by Nechayev, walking toward his ideal isolation. Raven descended from the ridge into the gorge, moving with a concentration and silence that had earned him his nickname. He was firmly convinced that the killer, convinced of his invulnerability, was not expecting to be pursued. He was waiting for peace. An hour later, when it was completely dark and a light but steady snowfall had begun, Raven and Shadow reached the plateau. Ahead, leaning against a rock, stood the stone ear, an abandoned winter hut, his perfect shelter.
Thin but steady smoke rose from the chimney. Nechayev was there. He had achieved his ideal storm. Now it was Raven's turn. Raven and Shadow approached the foot of the rock, where the abandoned stone-ear hut was hidden in the dwarf pine forest. It had been snowing for about 40 minutes. A thin, prickly dust that quickly erased all traces, covering the taiga with a perfect, deceptive whiteness. Absolute silence reigned around them, broken only by the rustle of the wind. The smoke from the hut's chimney was barely visible, but it was steady, indicating methodical and long-term heating. Nechayev was sure that no one would find him. He was waiting for a storm shadow to cover up his lies, whispered Raven, pressing himself against the rock so that their silhouettes would not be visible against the white snow. He thinks he's in control of this game. The Raven did not approach the hut directly. He knew that Nechayev, as a man seeking control, could not leave his refuge without a psychological trap. Not a physical one, designed for a moose or a bear, but a trap designed for a city investigator. A man who looks for obvious clues and is afraid of getting confused. He began to slowly circle the perimeter. His gaze, sharpened by years of living in the forest, scanned every boulder, every branch. And he found it. The trap. Nechayev did not bother to camouflage the entrance or set snares. He did something more subtle. He deliberately created a false trail about 50 meters from the hut. The trail was fresh, clear, imprinted in the first thin layer of snow. It was surprisingly deep, as if the person had been running, stumbling, and then turned sharply toward a thick spruce forest, where there was a swamp under the snow. The trail was jagged, showing signs of panic. It was the trail of Svetlov or Zvereva, the trail of an inexperienced, frightened city dweller who suddenly panicked and ran into the wilderness. That's your mistake, Physicist, Voron whispered, leaning over the fake trail. You created what you want us to see. You decided that we were looking for panic. The killer, who was confident in his perfection, couldn't abandon his scenario. He faked panic to make Raven, whom Pavlov probably described as a seeker of truth in matter, follow a deliberately false trail that led to a swamp and wasted precious time. But Voron knew that Nechayev, for all his outward exhaustion, was too controlling and calculating a man to allow himself real, uncontrollable panic. His lie was excessive. A real fugitive in a panic would not have run so carefully along the edge of the swamp. He would have simply fallen in, not noticing the danger. Nechayev, on the other hand, created a trail that looked like panic, but was laid out with perfect calculation so as not to fall in himself. Voron ignored the false trail. He went around using his own more difficult route and approached the hut from the rear, from the side of the cliff. He knew that Nechayev, convinced that his trap had worked, was sitting inside, warming himself and waiting for his perfect storm to finish its work. He slowly approached the only window, which was covered by an old, thick shutter. A faint light shone through the crack. The shadow sat quietly next to him, like a statue. Raven took out his binoculars and, leaning against the cold stone, looked inside through the tiny crack. Nechayev was sitting at a small table. He was busy working, not resting. In front of him lay the same angular metal box, a case for measuring instruments, that had left a mark on Pavlov's windowsill. Next to him, laid out in perfect order,
was Pavlov's diary. The scientist who wanted to rewrite reality was not resting. He was analyzing his triumph. Voron understood. Nechayev was on the plateau not just to wait it out. He was here to finalize his system. He didn't just kill Pavlov. He took his legacy, his notes on mirrors, and possibly his philosophical justification. He was preparing to write a new truth. In Nechayev's hands, Raven noticed a thin, shiny object, a surgical scalpel or a thin blade.
Nechayev slowly and methodically cut something out of Pavlov's diary. He was destroying the original source, not to hide it, but to correct it. He was removing the fragments that could contradict his new order. At that moment, Voron understood the full depth of the murderer's pride. Nechayev was so confident in his infallibility that he didn't even hide the evidence. He improved it. He believed that no one but him could understand the logic behind his actions. Voron quietly walked around the hut and pushed the front door. It was locked with a simple internal latch. He did not try to break it down. He knocked sharply and loudly, like a clap of thunder. Alexander Nechayev, this is Voron. You're mistaken. Your trail leads to the swamp, but I found you on the plateau. Your storm started too late. Inside, there was dead silence. The light went out. Voron waited, feeling the snow cover his shoulders. Nechayev did not run, scream, or resist. He was thinking. He was weighing his chances, analyzing the new variable. You calculated the logistics, physicist. The raven continued, his voice low, penetrating through the wood. You calculated fatigue and meaningless movement to deceive the city investigator. But you forgot about the Taiga. You made a mistake that contradicts its laws. You left the trail that lies about panic, when in fact you were too confident. And pride is the worst imbalance that nature does not forgive. The door slowly creaked open. Nechayev stood in the doorway. He held an angular case in his hand, and his eyes were cold and bodiless. He did not look defeated. He looked puzzled, like a scientist whose perfect formula had failed because of an unknown variable. How? Nechayev asked. There was no fear in his voice, only a thirst for knowledge. I calculated everything. I took into account fatigue, time, camouflage. I created a perfect second reflection of my path. You were supposed to go to the swamp. Your trap was designed for fear, replied Voron. And I was looking for confidence. Your pride made you believe that you could imitate panic without losing control. You are too perfect, Nechayev. Your fugitive's tracks were laid with the intention of not falling into the swamp. A real panicker would have fallen. Your lie was too perfect. Voron stepped forward, letting the snow fall on the threshold of the winter hut. The shadow stood nearby, ready. You caught us with the psychology of lies, and I caught you with the physics of pride. And now you will give me back what you took from Pavlov. The silence that followed Raven's words was as thick as the blanket of snow that was now actively falling on the plateau. Nechayev stood in the doorway, his impeccable appearance and mask of logic beginning to crack. He made no move to attack or flee. He was only interested in the mistake. Mistake? You're talking about a mistake. Nechayev's voice sounded even, but there was a subtle cold vibration in it that Voron had already heard at the locked door. It was not emotion.
but a frequency disturbance. My path was perfectly calculated, a meaningless movement, an alibi of fatigue. Isolation in the stone ear, a guarantee that the storm would cover the tracks. And the false trail of panic was supposed to drive you, like any city investigator, into the swamp.
My system was consistent. Your system was dishonest, replied Raven, stepping closer. The snow crunched under his boots. The shadow remained motionless, like a dark shadow on a white background. The Taiga does not forgive arrogance, Physicist. You caught me with fear, but I was looking for pride. You imitated panic, but your steps were too precise to be real panic. Your fake trail of a fugitive was laid out with the intention of not falling into the swamp.
A real, frightened person would have fallen and left their mark there forever. Your lie was too perfect. Nechayev bowed his head. A spark flashed in his eyes, not anger, but recognition of the fact. It's all about one miscalculated step, about excessive precision.
No, Physicist. Voron cut him off. It was a tiny scratch on Pavlov's windowsill. It was the nervous movement you made when your animal terror at what you had done broke through your intellectual control.
It was a needle error, Nechayev. Your body betrayed your mind. Your pride made you believe that you could control your physiology, even after murder. And nature always finds a loophole.
It does not forgive when order is created through lies. Nechayev slowly lowered the toolbox onto the floor of the hut. The sound was dull and final.
Pavlov had to die, he said, and the phrase sounded like a scientific conclusion rather than an admission.
He threatened order. You've read his notes on mirrors. He wasn't just treating us, Ivan Andreevich. He was a malicious destroyer. We, me, Svetlov, Svereva, all of us who came here to get rid of the urban lies, we began to realize that the truth was too painful, too chaotic, and we created our own collective reality.
The scientists gestured toward Pavlov's diary lying on the table. We understood that in order to live, we needed to control the lie, not destroy it.
We created our own small, ideal system of isolation and mutual support. He called it reflections. We began to reflect each other, creating a new, comfortable truth. Pavlov saw this. He realized that his patients had not been healed, but had conspired against reality. And he decided to destroy it. Nechayev took a step forward, and now his eyes met Voron's heavy gaze.
He threatened to publish his notes to reveal our collective lie to the world. He called us a plague. And I am a physicist. I know that to preserve the system, it is necessary to remove the non-functioning element.
Pavlov became a variable that threatened the common good. I killed to preserve our reflection, our only chance to live in peace. He did not ask for forgiveness. He demanded understanding of his logic.
For Nechayev, murder was not a moral fall, but a logical imperative. Voron shook his head. You talk about order, physicist, but you have violated the most important law, the law of justice. You did not restore order. You distorted it.
You use the Taiga to hide your lies, but the Taiga does not serve liars.
He pointed to a tiny scratch on his palm, where his hunting knife had instinctively clenched in response to the threat. Your system was based on lies,
and any system based on untruth is doomed to self-destruction. Pavlov may have been a destroyer, but you became an executioner, appropriating for yourself the right to absolute truth. Nechayev was silent, staring at the snow.
Perhaps for the first time in many years, his ideal formula had encountered an irrational force. The force of conscience, carried by Voron, and the force of nature that covered their tracks. What now? Nechayev asked quietly.
Now, restoring order, Voron replied.
He took out an old, well-used satellite phone and turned it on. The cold wind howled, intensifying the feeling of isolation. I will pass on your coordinates and your confession. You will return to the urban lie you so wanted to escape from, to answer to its laws. Nechayev nodded, his face once again serene, almost philosophical. He accepted his fate, as he would have accepted the result of a failed experiment.
He knew that his pride and excessive confidence in the power of his intellect against the laws of nature and conscience had led to his downfall.
Voron relayed the coordinates over the phone, clearly, without unnecessary words.
Major Gromov, dissatisfied but unable to ignore this kind of information, would soon arrive in an all-terrain vehicle. Voron felt neither triumph nor joy, only a quiet, deep sadness. Another sick individual had been removed from the ecosystem.
When the connection was lost, Raven looked at Nechayev, who was now just sitting by the dying stove. Your reflection was false, Physicist. And nature always brings us back to true matter. Raven did not wait for the police to arrive. His work was done. He was not seeking revenge. He was seeking balance. He left the hut in the intensifying snowfall. The shadow, as always, followed him. They headed deep into the Taiga, toward the untouched, distant ridges. They left behind them snow that would quickly cover all traces, both the killers and Ravens. Justice had been restored, but not according to the human code, but according to the law of the forest, a law that demands honesty and does not forgive arrogance. The story of Alexander Nechayev, Kirill Svetlov, and Margarita Zvereva was complete. They were unable to escape the lies of the city because they were unable to escape themselves. The Raven and the Shadow walked toward eternity, leaving behind city passions, philosophical traps, and lies. The Taiga was once again in balance, and only the deep, silent snow knew what had really happened here.